Our speaker tonight has written a number of books. He's loved and he's hated. I love him. Now, with that said, for a number of years, starting in 63, Robert, he would stand on Elm Street, and he had a little booth, and he would sell books. And what he believed, the evidence he's gathered at that time, and he's gathered lots more evidence since then, and he's still gathering evidence. He hadn't stopped. And he's been arrested how many times? 77 times?
I was arrested twice, but ticketed 84.
Ticketed 84 times. And is it true that the last time that you were brought before the magistrate, he told the city of Dallas, quit this or I'll put you in jail yourself?
What he actually said was that what they're doing to me was violation of First Amendment rights, and it was federal. And he said we should go and sue in federal court, which we did. Took 7 years, but we won.
There you go. So don't mess with him. And one reason it caught my attention, his attorney, I barely knew in college. I went to Austin College. But anytime I see somebody who's gone to Austin College in the paper, I want to read about them. And his name was Brad Gaziah. We were never friends, but he was kind of a quiet guy in college. Man, I didn't realize he was mean at the courthouse. Anyways, it is my honor to introduce Robert Groden.
Thank you, Tom. Folks, it's now been almost 58 years since President Kennedy was killed. Next week will be 58th anniversary. I've been doing this now since the time it happened, and I started when I was 18 years old. The president was killed on my 18th birthday, and I started studying it right away and collecting everything I could. And in 1975, I appeared on a TV show called Good Night America with Geraldo Rivera and Dick Gregory. And I released the film of the assassination, which you'll be seeing in a little bit, on that particular show. Very soon thereafter, I was invited to Washington, D.C. to present the evidence before the House of Representatives. I did, and within days, the case was reopened. And that's the history of it. It's my little place in history, I guess, but I'm glad I was able to do it. I would do it again. Fortunately, several years ago, my wife Janet, who's sitting right there, we met in Dealey Plaza, where the president was shot. And 2 years ago, we were married in Dealey Plaza, which was a terrific situation. Anyway, the assassination has been a major part of my life now for 58 years. And what I'm going to show you here is some of the key photographic evidence in the case. We do have a new book in the back which has 1,000 photographs in it, many of which have never been released before. But let's give it a try. That's the new book. It's called Jfk Absolute Proof. And as I said, it's got 1,000 pictures colored throughout. President Kennedy went to Texas in November of 1963 to cement relations within the state's Democratic Party. It was completely splintered, and he tried to bring everybody together. That's why he came down. This was the first trip he did on his re-election campaign. The morning of the assassination, he was in Fort Worth, and he gave a speech in the parking lot of the Texas Theater. And here he is with Governor John Connally, Senator Ralph Yarborough, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson. And here he is finishing up his speech before he went in to address an overflow crowd indoors. And there's Johnson on the right. Question is, would you buy a used car from that man? He then flew an 8-minute flight from Fort Worth to Dallas, and he went to Love Field, and here he is at Love Field being greeted by the crowd. Mrs. Kennedy in her famous pink outfit. Then the president got into the rear of the Lincoln limousine with Mrs. Kennedy, and sitting directly in front of him was Governor Connolly. This is their positions in the car. Now, so the first thing that really started happening that is really questionable is the Secret Service agent, Donald Lawson, who was supposed to be riding directly behind the president, was told to stay behind, and he had no idea what was going to happen. He was absolutely confused, and he wanted to know why, but I don't think he ever found out. He's the one who would have jumped on the back of the car to protect the president when the shooting started. He wasn't there. Down Main Street, the crowds were as many as 12 to 15 deep, and they were very, very friendly toward the president. Then he entered Dealey Plaza. If you've never been to Dealey Plaza, it's a small park-like area. It's from north to south, it's 2 blocks wide, and from east to west, it's 1 block. Here we see the president entering the plaza. Let's see if I can get this. There he is, right there. And this is the Texas School Book Depository building. This is the window that Lee Harvey Oswald is supposed to be in at this time. Now, this is the plaza. For those of you who are not familiar with it, the car entered here on Main Street, headed north for 1 block on Houston Street, and then down Elm Street. The shooting started about here and ended here. This is the area known as the Grassy Knoll. This is the triple underpass. There's the underpass. This is the Grassy Knoll. This is Elm Street. You can see there's an S-curve to it. And this is where the shooting began, right about here, and ended right about here. This is the moment of the shooting. The president has heard the first shot and is now looking toward the Grassy Knoll. There's the area here. The man who took the Zapruder film, Abraham Zapruder, is standing right here with his secretary, Marilyn Sitzman. Now, this is the actual assassination. These are the lead motorcycles turning into Dealey Plaza. There's the president's car turning onto Houston Street.
Now turning on to Houston Street, heading for the corner of Elm Street, and the crowds are just beginning to thin out.
The car heads north for 1 block on Houston Street to the corner of Elm. Now, this film was taken from the 4th floor of the depository as the president's car approached. This is the shot that would have been taken if you're not waiting for crossfire.
The president's car is now turning onto Elm Street, and it will be only a matter of minutes before he arrives at the trademark. I was on Simmons Freeway earlier, and even the freeway was jam-packed with spectators waiting their chance to see the president as he made his way toward the trademark.
Here he is in front of the depository. Now, this is a compilation of films taken in Dealey Plaza. And I released every one of these. The government had them all, and they never released any of them.
It appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by.
Notice everybody's running to the front, to the grassy knoll.
There's numerous people running up the hill alongside Elm Street, there by the Simmons Freeway. Several police officers are rushing up the hill at this time. Stand by. Just a moment, please. Something has happened in the motorcade route. Stand by, please.
After the assassination, President Johnson was sworn in on Air Force One. Mrs. Kennedy was made to be there for the Kodak moment. Johnson, after he finished being sworn in, turned to his friend, Congressman Thomas, and the two of them were looking and smiling at each other and winking. It's called the wink photograph. This was a part of an entire series of photographs that were taken on the plane, but on the original strip, this particular frame was cut out. 10 months later, Lyndon Johnson received the Warren Report, the original copy of the Warren Report from Earl Warren, and his sole comment was, "It's awful heavy." The Warren Report said that this man, Lee Harvey Oswald, a 24-year-old ex-Marine, fired all of the shots that killed the president and wounded Governor Connally. And they created something called the single bullet theory. I have another name for it, but mixed company, I'm not going to say what it was. It sounds like single bullet theory. This is it. The bullet was supposed to have come down from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, hitting President Kennedy, according to them, in the back of the neck. Of course, it wasn't. It was farther down in the back. The bullet exited his throat, then made a zigzag turn to hit Governor Connally in the right shoulder by the armpit. The bullet exited his chest, made a right-hand turn to hit his right wrist, and then made a U-turn to bury itself into his left thigh. This is the single bullet theory. Now here's the president and Governor Connally as they were sitting in the exact position at the moment of the first shot. Now the little black arrows I put there show where the president and Governor Connally were actually hit. Now there's a problem for them, and the problem is this. With the bullet coming down from the 6th floor of the depository, hitting the president in the back here, going on to hit Governor Connally at this point, there is no way that that bullet could have gone through the president's throat, where there was a wound. This is the bullet that is supposed to have caused 7 separate wounds in 2 grown men. It's virtually pristine. It could almost be fired again. They call it the magic bullet or the single bullet. I call it single bullshit theory. But the man on the right is Arlen Specter, Senator Specter, now for a while after that point, now deceased. Senator Specter came up with the idea called the single bullet theory, and that is that the bullet hit President Kennedy first and then hit Governor Connally. The problem is that in order for the bullet to come out of his throat, as I just mentioned a moment ago, right here, the bullet has to enter his back way below the shoulder. This became part of the single bullet theory. Specter created something which I call the verbal plastic surgery. Moved the bullet from this point here, where it really went in, up to here to the back of his neck. Now, the bullet hitting the president on a right-to-left trajectory, based on where the actual wounds were, would miss Governor Connolly completely because he was sitting directly in front of the president. So what did they do? Years later, they came up with this theory that actually Governor Connolly was sitting inboard between the two seats. It's ridiculous, but that's what they said in order to make it fit. This is a model of the actual car itself, and you can see that the Connolly seat is directly in front of the president. He was not sitting here. This is a reconstruction. And it shows the president and Governor Connolly sitting directly in front of each other there. Now, the first bullet that hit anybody hit President Kennedy in the throat from the front, right here. Now, at this point, the shot is being fired and it hasn't hit the president in the throat yet. But he hears the first shot, and his hand starts to drop, and he disappears behind the road sign. And upon reemergence from behind the sign, he has been hit and his arm starts to come up toward his throat. Now here's where the president was shot in the throat. I took the actual autopsy photograph and I eliminated the tracheotomy, and this is what the president looked like when he was originally shot. This is after the tracheotomy. It was utilized, Dr. Perry utilized it to create a wound in the throat to insert a tracheal tube. The exit from the throat wound exited in the president's back up here at that point. Now, President Kennedy was hit in the back as well, exactly 2 seconds after the throat shot. At this point here, the president has clearly been hit. Now, Governor Connolly has not been hit. According to the single bullet theory, by now both men have been hit. The thing is, Governor Connolly in his right wrist is holding, in his right hand, he's holding this Texas-style Stetson hat. He could not possibly have done this after he was hit in the wrist because the distal end of the radius bone was fractured. And here's where he was actually hit. If you look at his shoulder, you see how his shoulder drops? His cheeks puff out, his hair becomes disheveled. Way after the president has already responded to the shot. Clearly, there were two separate shots. The single bullet theory was a joke. This is where Governor Connolly was hit in the back. This point here. I'm sorry, this is where President Kennedy was hit in the back. The bullet hit him at this point here, but that was the second bullet that hit him. There's the bullet hole in the back of his shirt. And this is the autopsy face sheet, from the autopsy face sheet, and it shows the exact spot where the president was hit. In the back, not in the back of the neck. He was hit too low for the bullet to have come from the 6th floor and exited the president's throat. This is the president's autopsy stating that a second wound occurred in the posterior back at about the level of the third thoracic vertebra. This is pretty accurate to the exact spot. In a man of President Kennedy's size, this would be about 6 or 7 inches below the shoulder line. And there's the entrance wound in his back, 2 inches below where the first bullet exited. 2 separate shots, 2 separate directions, therefore a conspiracy. 2 FBI agents, Frank O'Neill and James Siebert, testified that the bullet was recovered from the body of the president. Now, this could not have happened if the bullet had gone through him and hit Governor Connolly. None of it makes any sense, but they stuck with the single bullet theory. Now, here's where Governor Connolly was hit in the back. At this point here, he has not yet been hit. But here's where he is hit. Notice his cheeks have started to puff out, his hair becomes disheveled, and his shoulder drops. It's really a marked point where his shoulder drops at this point here. This is where the governor was hit. He was actually suffered several shots, but the single bullet theory says that he was hit in the shoulder here. The bullet exited his chest here by the right nipple. The bullet then went through his right wrist and buried itself into his left thigh. One bullet after it struck President Kennedy. This is the single bullet theory. This is actually where Governor Connally was hit. He was out by the right armpit. That's where it exited his chest. And then went on to hit his wrist, his right wrist at this point here. He was holding that Texas Stetson hat in his hand. At this point, he is still holding it. This is way after both men were supposed to have been hit. He's still holding the hat in his hand. Notice there's no blood at all on his wrist. The wrist was shattered. It would have been soaked with blood by now, which shows he was actually hit by a separate bullet in the wrist. And then he's pushed downward and forward. What you're seeing is actually from the Zapruder film, and it's the exact situation that happened during the actual shooting. From Governor Connally's wrist, this was one of the many fragments that were removed from the wrist, and it weighs more than the total weight missing from the so-called magic bullet. Here's where he was hit in the thigh, above the knee. 4 hours later, this bullet was still in Governor Connally's leg, and the so-called magic bullet was on Air Force One on its way back to Washington, D.C. Okay, this is the fatal headshot. This is what killed President Kennedy. This is frame 312 of the Zapruder film. This is 313, the moment that the fatal shot struck him in the right temporal area and threw him to the rear and to the left. If he'd have been shot from behind, he would have been thrown forward. It's called transfer of momentum. Newton's third law of motion tells us this. Note, bullet entrance wounds are always the size of a bullet, and exit wounds are always larger, usually much larger. Where were the actual wounds in President Kennedy's head? I spoke with several witnesses to the assassination and to the life-saving efforts in the autopsy. And every single one of them said that the exit wound was in the back of the president's head. What we have here is several of the witnesses in Dealey Plaza, again saying that the fatal wound was in the back of the head. And now the doctors from Parkman Hospital, which I interviewed, again, they all said exactly the same thing, that the exit wound was in the back of the head. They were consistent. All in all, 88 witnesses said that the bullet exited in the rear, a bullet entering from the front, which means it did not come from the book depository. This is Robert Knudsen. He was the autopsy photographer, one of the several photographers, and he testified before the House Assassinations Committee that the fatal wound came from the front, exited the rear, and that the autopsy photographs shown to him at the time were not legitimate. Dr. Robert McClelland in 1966 drew this picture for Josiah Thompson in his classic book, 6 Seconds in Dallas. This was extremely important. I know that Dr. McClelland spoke here. He was a great man, and I had the honor of portraying him in the movie JFK. In all, 88 medical witnesses to the rear exit wound of President Kennedy's head in addition to the many witnesses in Dealey Plaza. Every single witness, I repeat, every single witness said to the head wounds testified that the wound was in the rear of the president's skull. Now, these are two very, very graphic and very disturbing photographs of the president's head. I'm going to show you. If you're upset by this sort of thing, please don't look at it. This is where the bullet entered the president's head in the right temporal area, right here, and blew out the back of his head, back here. There's the throat wound. This is a rear of the head, as described by all the doctors. This is a CGI version of it that I made from the original photograph. And this is what the doctors all said was the way the president's head looked. They all said that the autopsy photographs, which I showed them, which are the ones that were reviewed by the House Assassinations Committee, were inaccurate. Now, this is the president at frame 312. You see the back of his head is relatively flat, all things considered. And this is frame 335 of the Zapruder film, which shows the exit wound in the back of the head. There's the exit wound again. The hole is back here in the rear of the skull, and the hair is being driven up the avulsed exit wound in the back of the president's head. The Nix film, taken from the other side of the street, at the moment of the explosion, there's part of the president's head in the explosion. There's a piece of his head being blasted to the rear. Here you can see the total difference in the back of the president's head. There's the explosion to his head. This is a piece of the president's skull. It's called the Harper fragment. It was found 54 feet to the rear of from where the president was shot. It's 3.5 inches wide. Mrs. Kennedy, immediately after the shooting in shot, climbed out of the trunk of the car and picked up a piece of the president's head called the Delta fragment, which is back here. She brought it back into the car and carried it all the way to Parkland Hospital and gave it to one of the doctors and said, "Will this help?" Now, 6 shots missed completely. These were ignored by the Warren Commission. This is one that a witness named Jean Newman told me about. She said she was actually standing over here on the north curb. But here, at this point here, there's Phil Willis taking his picture. And there's nothing wrong with the street at all. And then 1/18 of a frame later, you can see the result of a bullet actually striking the street right there. And then the following frame, 1/18 of a second later, the residue was lying in the street. I asked Miss Newman, I said, where did the bullet come from? She said, well, the residue went to the rear, so the shot came from the front. This is the president's car during the shooting. After the first volley of shots, there's no damage at all to the president's windshield. But a few seconds later, the sun is reflecting off of a bit of damage to the windshield right here. That's a shot which missed. And around that time, too, another bullet hit the chrome over the windshield from behind. Another one hit by the manhole cover across the street from where Zapruder was standing, and it hit the cement. If you've been to the plaza or if you're planning on going, that bullet mark is still there to this day. That's what it looked like when I photographed it in 1971. A man identified as an FBI agent came in, picked up the bullet that was found in the grass, had it in his hand, and put it into his pocket. And that's the last time we see it. It's never been turned into evidence. That's the bullet mark. As you can see, it did not come from the depository. The depository is over here. This came from the roof of the Dallas Records building right there. Another one struck the south curb of Main Street. That's where the bullet hit, and it caused fragments of the bullet and the curb itself to fly up and hit this man, James Tague, on the cheek. Here he is just a few moments later. That's where the bullet hit him. Another one hit the sidewalk in front of the book depository on the north side of Elm Street. And it did not come from the depository window where Oswald was supposed to be. It came from the other end here. This picture was taken by an Army intelligence officer named James Powell about 30 seconds after the shooting. And it shows the 6th floor window Oswald was supposed to be in. And he's not there, but somebody else is. Here it is again. There's the window. These are the boxes in the window. And just beside the box, you can see the shape of a leg. Right there. That's not one of the boxes. These are the boxes. There is somebody still in that window. But when this picture was taken, Lee Oswald was on the 2nd floor talking to a woman named Geraldine Reed, getting change for the Coca-Cola machine. This was Oswald's alibi. They couldn't bring this stuff in court, so that's why they had to kill him. There it is again. There's the box, and he's gone by now. This is sometime well after that point. These are the boxes in the window. This is the alleged sniper's nest. One of the problems is there's not enough room here for anybody to actually be in if they're shooting left-handed or right-handed, either way. This is a steam pipe that is blocking that particular point. Now, this picture was taken by a Dallas Morning News photographer, and that's the so-called Oswald window. This woman here on the 4th floor is taking a film of the assassination at this time. When I worked for the House Assassinations Committee one Sunday morning, I saw that there was a whole pile of photographs, negatives, things of that nature. And I asked if I could take a look at them. They said, sure. That was my job anyway. And I found this original negative. Now, every time this picture had ever been published, starting that day, all of this was cropped out. This part here was not shown. The round window is the last one that you see. The square one is not seen. I looked at this, I saw that it showed in the window, it showed in the negative, and they let me borrow it, and I blew it up and found that there actually is somebody else in the window on the 6th floor. This white spot here is a light on the ceiling behind him, and there's his head, hairline, cheeks, his chin. And messing with it by changing the contrast, you can see more detail in his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He's wearing a white T-shirt, and there's the light on the ceiling behind him. The entire 6th floor of the depository is one room. If somebody was in the so-called Oswald window, he's in the same window as this guy, and each one would know about the other. However, when those pictures were taken, Lee was on the 2nd floor in the snack room buying the Coca-Cola. He was seen there just 72 seconds after the shooting. There's no way in the world he could get down because 2 women, Sandra Stiles and Victoria Adams, were walking down the stairs and nobody passed them. Now here's Oswald being arrested at the Texas Theater. There's Oswald right there. He's being thrown into an unmarked police car and taken in for questioning. As you will see later on after the presentation, I have a very rare thing back there. I actually have pictures, not pictures, I actually have tickets from the Texas Theater from 1963. I'll show you those. Now that night at midnight, Jack Ruby was about to enter history. Here he is in the back of the questioning, the midnight press conference, and he is stalking Oswald. Here he is on Sunday morning. That's him. He races through the crowd, shoots Oswald, silencing the man accused of shooting the president and preventing there from being a trial. Now, Oswald was framed. How was he framed? Well, several ways, but one of them was this. These two pictures were found in Ruth Payne's garage. Ruth Payne was a woman who lived in Oak Cliff, and she had owned the house where Oswald's wife Marina was staying. These two pictures were found in the garage, and they're fakes. They're total fakes. Oswald himself said they were. He said, "That's my face, but not my body." If you look here, you don't have to look very carefully, but there, you see the crop line through the center of the chin? That's where Oswald's face up here was pasted on someone else's body. There's the crop line through the chin. When I brought this up to the House Assassinations Committee, they said, "Oh, it's just facial acne." Now here's Oswald under arrest. You see he has a pointed chin with a cleft in it. The man in the photograph, the two backyard photographs, has a square chin, no cleft. There's quite a difference. So for years I've been referring to this as the world's first chin transplant. A great many witnesses, about 80% of the witnesses, said that they were aware of shots or a shot from the Grassy Knoll, which was the right front of the president. There's the Zapruder standing there taking the film. There's the president, and here's the Grassy Knoll. There's the stockade fence on top of the knoll. And this dark shape here, right beside the tree, is actually the man who fired the fatal shot. Immediately after the shooting, about 400 witnesses ran up the Grassy Knoll, chasing the assassin. Now, the House Assassinations Committee came up with something no one had ever done before. They did acoustic testing of shots from the Grassy Knoll based on a Dallas police tape that was made by this man, H.B. McLean. McLean's microphone on his motorcycle stuck open, and he recorded the sounds of the shots. This is the testing that the House Committee did from the sixth floor window and from the stockade fence. And the answer to the testing was that a spot 8 feet to the west of the corner of the stockade fence, right here by the tree, is where the fatal shot came from. This picture was taken at the exact moment. There's the shape, there's the tree. Once again, this is the whole area of the Grassy Knoll at the exact moment of the fatal headshot. And there's the shape again, right by the tree. Now, when the acoustics scientists gave their report to the House Assassinations Committee, they did not know that this photograph even existed. I was there when they testified, and I showed it to them right afterwards. They couldn't believe that they had this kind of proof backing up their theory. This is a document, CIA document 1035-960. And 1035-960 shows the CIA's war against researchers in the critical community, such as myself. Blow it up, it says that the CIA and others that were being paid by them should employ propaganda assets to answer and refute the attacks of the critics, like myself. It shows that they say we're in it for the money, we're tied into our own theories, and blah, blah, blah. But they actually had a formal policy of dealing with people like me. Now, we have seen on TV several documentaries, I call them mockumentaries, because they misrepresent the evidence. This is the reality. This is the Zapruder film at the exact moment of the fatal shot. 1/18th of a second later, the head explodes. When the mockumentary was done, they put Mrs. Kennedy's head behind the president, and then the caption, the verbal caption on it says, if the shot had come from the Knoll, we would have had a dead Mrs. Kennedy. But that's not where she was sitting. I told them that, and they told me to mind my own business. I told them this is my business. The book Absolute Proof, which we have back there, is my newest book on the assassinations, my 8th one. And the book has 1,000 photographs in it, color throughout. The concept was to create an archive of the photographic evidence in the case. The Kennedy assassination is the most photographed crime of any type in the history of mankind. In the book, I have stuff which was just discovered. One of the doctors at the life-saving efforts of Lee Oswald took pictures, took 9 rolls of film, and they were confiscated and held aside for over 40 years. The film was kept in very hot areas in Florida and very humid. The film itself was virtually unusable. I was given the 9 rolls of film. I took them to the only processing lab in the country that still processes that old, outdated film. When we got the film back from the machine, there was nothing that you could see with the naked eye. It was just all black. I came up with the idea of using a chemical called Farmer's Reducer to eliminate a lot of the black, and this is what we ended up with. 88 pictures usable of showing Oswald's last moments. Now, this may not work because the other one didn't work either, but this is the second head wound. This is what was discovered and is in the book for the first time. At this point here, the president has already been hit in the head. He's responding to that first shot at this point. And he's hit again in the second head a second time, and the blood brain material were being blown out of the front of his head. You see here Mrs. Kennedy's black collar, and here much of the collar you can't see because of the blood. There it is. Go back again. As it comes out, there were 2 headshots, first from the front, second from behind, 0.7 of a second later. See how it comes out? The president's brain, as you may be aware, was missing for a lot of years. In 1966, they looked for it, couldn't find it. It was just gone from the National Archives. Nobody knew what happened to it. When I worked for the government, I found in the National Archives photographs, which are all in the book, showing where the president's brain was. It was in this box. Inside the box is a stainless steel container with the president's brain. And here they are putting it in the ground when they reburied the president at the final resting place in Arlington National Cemetery. When I worked for the House Committee, I found a 2.5-page document which we call the smoking gun document. This was written by the head of the Secret Service, the head of the CIA to the head of the Secret Service, and it says, among other things, that Oswald was trained by the CIA. It's 2.5 pages long, and it's signed by John McCone, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. It says that Oswald, let's see if I can read it from back here. Oswald's subject was trained by this agency under cover of the Office of Naval Intelligence. And on it goes to say how we sent him to the Soviet Union, that he was not a defector. It goes on and on. This is a very important document, and this is published in the book for the first time. What really happened to President Kennedy? We may never know it all. We know a lot more than the government ever wanted us to. And as I've said several times through the decades, may all the truth be known. It may be too late for justice in this case, but it's never too late for the truth. Thank you.
He and I are two of the very few people who ever interviewed Dr. Malcolm Perry. And I interviewed him there at the St. Paul Hospital in 2002 or somewhere in that neighborhood, 2003. And I wanted to see if and you're seeing this for the first time, we hadn't practiced this. I want to make sure my recollection and your recollection are similar. First of all, he grew up here in Allen. That's why I had an entree into his office. It's not because I was a JFK historian, but there was one rule, and this is why it's kind of confusing to me. No notes, no recorders, and no photographs.
That's what he said to me too. Would not allow it.
And of course, when you're writing something, I cannot tell you how important it is to take notes, because your memory in 30 minutes now, what did he say? I mean, and I have a good memory, but he told me the first thing he learned in med school, in ER training, stop the bleeding and start the breathing. And for a split second, he thought there was, I think, a team of 8 or 10, 12 doctors there around the president. And they all had a specific task. And he thought for a brief second, he could save the life of the president, because that bullet in the neck had miraculously avoided the carotid artery and the spinal column, and he had done a number of what they call Saturday night killings, because he was one of the young docs. He got the Saturday night specials, they called them. And so he had done a lot of emergency work on the neck in his career, and he found it miraculous and so he had said that if it hadn't been for the other bullet or more, that he thought the president's life could be saved. And so he started to do what he'd do best, was to clear the throat so he could start the breathing and then stop the bleeding. But then shortly after the tracheotomy, he said that, I believe Dr. McClellan said, "Mac, this is massive over on the other side." Can you comment on that?
Well, Dr. McClellan, who was a friend of mine, I actually got to play him in the movie JFK, was one of the doctors who saw the exit wound, was very, very open about it, actually started speaking about it before any of the others. And when I interviewed Dr. Perry, it was at New York Hospital in 1988, I think. And I showed him the autopsy photographs for the first time. He had never seen them. And he was standing up at his desk, and he said, "I didn't do that. That's a butcher job." And I wish like heck that he'd have allowed us to record it, but he wouldn't. He had said at the time of the assassination that the fatal shot came from the front, and he never changed his mind about that. He told me that the shot came from the front.
This is where I'm going to ask some tough questions. The standalone theory people argue that the sewer lines, a lot of the conspiracy theories argue that that some of the shooters came up through the sewer lines. And the standalone folks say there's no way a human being, the sewer lines were not big enough for them to crawl in and out of. They weren't that big. Do you have any comment on that one?
Well, at the moment of the fatal shot, and I actually photographed it from inside the sewer, you cannot see the president where he was at the time of the fatal shot until 54 feet later. The shots could not have come from there. Escape would have been impossible because it's so thin. Maybe a jockey or a child could have gotten away, but somebody tried to prove that happened and got stuck. They had to call the fire department to get him out.
So that eliminates the sewer possibilities.
There's all kinds of theories like that. The sewer shots, the thought that the driver turned around and shot the president. None of this stuff is true. The fatal shot did come from the front, from behind the stockade fence. What we did, and I didn't mention this before, Officer McLean had recorded the shots by accident. He didn't even know he had done it. I was called down to Washington to present and synchronize the Zapruder film with the acoustics tape, the actual recording. And we had found out that based on the computer analysis of echo patterns, that the fatal shot had come from 8 feet to the west of the corner of the stockade fence. Exactly there. And with a maximum possible error of 6 inches. Well, I showed just now pictures of the point where they said the shot came from. What I did is I synchronized the original Secret Service copy of the film, which had no splices in it, with the actual sound recording. And we found out that, in fact, the shots themselves were recorded. People who think that Oswald acted alone or state that Oswald acted alone ignore that completely. There's people who think that the fatal shots came from the South Knoll or the sewer, as you said, or other places too, in the trees or whatever. We know exactly where the fatal shot was fired from. There are other shots that were fired, such as the back shots and like that. We don't know exactly where they were fired from, since the likelihood is that at least 1 or 2 of the shots came from the so-called Oswald window. That's probably the case. But that could be wrong too. We just don't know. The shots from the front were synchronized by the acoustics tape and were found to come from that exact point. They didn't bother to do that from behind. They just assumed that all of the shots from behind came from the Oswald window. And the odds are very strong against that. Based on the rapidity of the shots and the directions, the odds are that they could not have come from the single shooter.
Now, the big question is, okay, so from what I understand in your presentation, the most convincing evidence you have is the shooter from the records building, top of the records building, I believe, and behind the grassy knoll, behind the stockade. Now, is that correct?
Well, it's part of it, yes. Some years ago, a bullet shell was found on the roof of the records building. Some years ago, they were just taking up the old roofing, the tar paper, the flashing, all of that. And when they were taking it up, they lifted up the flashing and a bullet shell fell out from there. I obtained the bullet. I still have the original shell and published pictures of that in in my magazine and my book.
Now that we've established that there's more than one shooter, who were they and why? Who hired them?
Well, the why is perhaps more important than the who right now. If you find out the why and can prove that, it'll tell you and give you the clues as to the who. We don't know. We do know. People ask me the question, have asked me this question for 58 years. Who killed President Kennedy? My answer is not Lee Harvey Oswald.
About 3 years ago, I witnessed, because I was there, probably one of the most acrimonious debates I ever witnessed about the assassination. And it was between the last living counsel for the Warren Commission. He's passed, everybody else has passed away except him. And Robert out of California, he lives in Arizona, taught at Notre Dame.
Oh, Professor Blakey?
Yeah, Robert Blakey.
Professor Robert Blakey was the director of the House Assassinations Committee, the third one and the final one. I spoke to Professor Blakey a couple of times around 1970, 78, and I said, "You don't believe the CIA is telling you the truth, do you?" He says, "I've worked with these people for over 20 years. You don't think they'd lie to me, do you?" I said, yeah. As it turns out, he eventually found out when it was too late that they were lying to him. The CIA sent somebody to be the liaison between the House Committee and the CIA, back and forth. And the man they chose was a man named George Joannides. And Mr. Joannides had been in charge of the people that Oswald was allegedly with in New Orleans, people from Florida too. And they never told Blakey that this was in fact the guy. And he didn't find out about it until like a decade or so later. He then said he would never trust a single word the CIA ever told him.
President Eisenhower said that too.
Well, I have to take their word for it.
That's another story for another time. This debate was so acrimonious. It started out, Professor Blakey was trying to be civil and respectful to the other side. In fact, he started out the debate by saying, "I want to honor my colleague for his intelligence and so forth." And the other guy said nothing. It was, most times when somebody, say we were in a debate and had the different point of view, and I started out with honoring your intelligence, and then the other would say, "And I honor yours," and then you start your disagreement. But he said nothing. That was my first clue this was going to get hot. And so I went up to the guy, not Professor Blakey. And by the way, I've tried to get him here. I went up to the other guy, and I said, "I want to know something about Oswald's last phone call on Saturday night, November 23rd, at about 10 o'clock. And I said, he called somebody in North Carolina. And what I want to know is why the Warren Commission did not address that phone call in very much detail. I would have wanted to know, first of all, I would have if I had been there, I would have let them have their conversation so we could see what they were saying. But they let him call this person, and the second that the other person said hello, the secrets, whoever it was, FBI or what have you, ordered Mrs. Sweeney, who I worked with at the city of Dallas, to pull the phone. So we'd have no clue what the conversation would have entailed. Can you just address that, please?
We don't know much of the details of that. I'm glad you knew about that. What we do know is that the midnight press conference, Oswald was asked by one of the reporters, "Did you shoot the president?" He says, "No, I haven't shot anybody." He says, "I've not been charged with that." And one of the reporters says, "You have been charged." He was charged with killing the president. They didn't even tell him. So, Oswald at that point said, I do request someone to come forward and represent me. Yet he was denied his civil rights. He was denied the opportunity to have counsel. And then, of course, Sunday morning, Jack Ruby shot and killed him. So we say goodbye to the idea of a trial.
Now, one of the standard questions that, because I've had this, I try to be fair and intellectually honest and present all sides. But we had a man here one time, and he said that Ruby, if he had planned on killing Oswald, would not have left his beloved dog, and I'm a dog person, so I understand, because I have, I have people know I have a dog, so that if something happens, the dog's taken care of. He left the dog in the car, and they claim that this is